Welcome to Intesa Sanpaolo On Air, the English Language Insight series jointly hosted by Intesa Sanpaolo and the University of Oxford, where we embark on global conversations with global leaders. My name is Rupert Younger, and in this episode, I'm really delighted to be sitting with someone who has embarked on the most extraordinary career transition from emerging markets investor to human rights activist and campaigner. With me today is Bill Browder. And Bill, it's a huge pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and great to be here. My story is a very unusual story from in all perspectives, but I set up an investment fund. It was called the Hermitage Fund, and the purpose of the fund was to invest in the newly privatized companies of Russia. Russia had effectively decided to give everything away for free in the mass privatization program.
So this was an emerging markets vehicle investing principally in Russia or only in Russia?
So the Hermitage Fund was designed to invest in former Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc. But at the time, Russia was the only game in town.
Right.
So when I started looking at Russia, the companies were valued at a 99.7% discount to the same type of companies in the West.
Now, you are known for an investment strategy which was forensic, where you went in and you started to look at ways in which the governance structures of these companies was undermining the fundamental value and trust from Western investors. And you sort of landed, if I can put words in your mouth, and you'll definitely correct me, but you landed on this idea that fundamentally there was some inherent corrupt practices happening where the state was being defrauded. And this was your starting point, that you were actually a partner almost with the Russian state in trying to expose the lack of taxes, the corrupt practices. Is that an accurate description of how you started the investment journey?
Well, so absolutely. So basically, when you're buying something at a 99.7% discount, there's a good reason why it's at that discount. And the main reason is that it was complete, absolute chaos in these companies. It's just everything was being stolen from the companies by the management, by oligarchs, by corrupt officials of other stripes and sorts. And so I said to myself, if this stuff is ever going to value itself as a normal, as it should be, which should have been a lot higher, we need to stop all this stealing that was going on in these companies. And now, it was a kind of challenging goal because there, in addition to all the stealing that was going on, there was also no sort of infrastructure. There was no institutions that were there to stop the stealing. So normally, here you would go to the Serious Fraud Office or the National Crime Agency or the Metropolitan Police or the Financial Conduct Authority. There's all these different institutions here. They had those institutions by name over there, but none of these people were actually doing those jobs.
Right.
And so how do you stop people from stealing when there's no institutions to help you in a country where the oligarchs were, ruling the roost?
You became public enemy number one for Vladimir Putin, and he very publicly at one point called for your extradition. Talk us through how you became the public enemy number one that you clearly are.
Well, so what happened was we said to ourselves, the only tool that we have to fight this corruption was our ability to research it, which we were very good at, and then our ability to share that research with the international media. And I have a team of incredibly smart Russian analysts. And interestingly, Russia is a place that has you would think of it as being a very opaque, secretive place, and it is in many respects. But one of the things which Russia is famous for is bureaucracy. I mean, it's the most bureaucratic place in the world. All information gets collected on every single thing that ever happens in Russia. It gets collected by people working in ministries that basically can't feed their families, and as a result, they put up all the information for sale. Everything is for sale. And I'm not talking about a lot of money. I'm talking about, for $5, you could buy a database with the information from the entire database of the Russian Federal Securities Commission, their SEC. Another $5 and you can buy the Russian Customs Committee database to show everything exported and imported.
So you used this radical transparency, this unexpected boon that you found in the bureaucratic systems in Russia to expose fraud and corruption in Russian companies. That put you in direct conflict with Putin. Tell us why and how that happened.
Well, it actually evolved. So when we first started doing this was when Putin had first come to power. And when Putin first came to power, he was not the same. He was very, very weak. All the power of the presidency had been stolen by these oligarchs informally. And so he came to power, but he wasn't powerful because the oligarchs were stealing power from him. And he wanted to get that power back. And here I was attacking the same people who were stealing power from him, who were stealing money from me. And so there's this expression, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so at first when we started putting all this stuff out there, and we put it out there, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, et cetera, Putin was actually liking it. He was liking it because I was attacking the people who were stealing from him. And so for a while, every time we would put one of these things out there, he would respond by going after the people we were exposing. And the share price would go up. And so it was an incredibly exciting time for me when this first started happening because I was making money and doing good in the same job.
So what changed?
Well, eventually, after several years of this, Putin decided to win his war with the oligarchs. And the way he did this was to arrest the richest man in Russia. His name was Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He arrested him, he put him on trial, and he allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. After Khodorkovsky was sentenced to 10 years in prison, the other oligarchs, this was now summer of 2004, the other oligarchs went to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And Putin said 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government, but 50% for Vladimir Putin.
So he suddenly became not the beneficiary of your exposure of fraud. He became the target of your exposure of fraud.
Exactly. And that's when everything started going badly for me.
Now, you were deported. Tell us how that felt. What happened?
November 2005, I had been living in Russia for 10 years. I was the largest foreign investor in the country. I had $4.5 billion invested in Russia. I was flying back from London to Moscow. I arrive at Sheremetyevo Airport. I go to the VIP lounge, which I'd been through like 250 times before. It's normally a 30-second procedure. I'm sitting there for an hour wondering what's going on. And then eventually 4 armed officials, police of some sort, burst into the VIP lounge, grab me, arrest me, take me down to the detention center of the airport, lock me up overnight. I wasn't sure whether I was being sent to Siberia or deported. And then the next morning, they stick me on an Aeroflot flight back to London, and they declare me a threat to national security of Russia, never to be allowed to come back into the country again.
Wow. Now, this leads us, I think, directly to this transition that you made from emerging market investor to human rights campaigner. Tell us the extraordinarily moving story of your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, what happened to him, and what you ended up then campaigning for.
So after I was expelled from Russia, first thing I did was I evacuated my staff, and then we sold everything we had in Russia. I didn't want my people to be arrested. I didn't want my assets to be seized. And we successfully got everybody out. And I thought that was the end of the story. It turns out to be the beginning of a terrible nightmare. 18 months after I was expelled from Russia, I get a call from the one person still sitting in Moscow working for me, a secretary in our empty Moscow office. And she said there are 25 police officers raiding our office. I then call up my American lawyer in Moscow. He tells me that there's 25 police officers raiding his office in Moscow looking for our documents. 50 police officers fanning out across Moscow, raiding everything to do with me. They were looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies the companies that we had used to invest in Russian securities, which were now empty because we had sold everything. They didn't know that. They found these documents at the law firm, the American law firm that we used. They seized the documents. The police seized the documents. And the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment companies. They had been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police. I was horrified, not for economic reasons, because our money had already been safely taken out of Russia. But I was horrified that if the police were working to steal our companies, I'm going to be walking through Frankfurt Airport someday and I'll be arrested on a Russian Interpol warrant. And so I go out to try to find the smartest lawyer in Moscow, and I find a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. He worked for an American law firm, and I asked him, can you figure out what these people are trying to do and stop it? He went out and did a big investigation, and he came back and he said, I figured out what they were trying to do. First thing they wanted to do was steal all of your money, but they didn't get it because you got your money out before then. He said, however, the second thing worked. And the second thing was that when we sold everything in the previous year after I'd been expelled, we had a huge profit. We had $1 billion of profit, and we paid $230 million of capital gains tax to the Russian government. And what Sergei had figured out was that the $230 million of capital gains tax that we paid, the people who stole our companies went back to the tax authorities, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't earn $1 billion. They earned zero. And they said, therefore, we would like the $230 million of taxes that was paid in the previous year back. They applied for an illegal tax refund on the 23rd of December, 2007, and it was approved and paid out the next day, Christmas Eve.
Unbelievable. I don't think that any tax payment ever has been approved or paid in anything like that timeline.
So this was a fraud. If I had legitimately overpaid $5,000 in taxes in 2007, I'd probably still be waiting for the refund in 2024.
Right.
It was crazy. And it was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, paid out overnight on Christmas Eve on a fraud. It was clearly an inside job. Sergei and I assumed this must be a rogue operation because this wasn't our money that was being stolen. This was the Russian government's money was being stolen. Taxes that we had been paid had been refunded from the Russian government. And so we figured if we just brought this to the attention at the highest level, then the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. So we wrote criminal complaints to every different law enforcement agency in Russia. I went to the television, radio, newspapers, told the story. And Sergei went to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI, and he gave sworn testimony against the police officers who conducted the raid that led to the fraud. And then we sat back and we waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. Instead of arresting the people who conducted the fraud, the people who Sergei accused, the people who did do the fraud, arrested Sergei. They arrested him. They put him in pretrial detention. They put him, and then they started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers. And they also wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million and he did so on my instruction. They figure, here's this guy, he wears a blue suit and a red tie and buys Starbucks in the morning and sits in a fancy American law firm. 1 week of this, he'll do whatever they want him to do. It turns out that they completely underestimated Sergei. Sergei was a man of incredible principle, integrity, and honesty, and for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more upsetting than the physical pain that they were subjecting him to, and he refused. As a result, the pressure and the torture got worse and worse and worse. And after about 6 months of this, he developed terrible pains in his stomach. He ended up losing about 15 kilos. And he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, the officials came to him again and again asked him to sign a false confession. Again, he refused. And in retaliation, they took him out of the prison that had a hospital, and they assigned him to a prison called Butyrka, which is considered as a maximum security prison, considered one of the most tough and awful prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, there was no medical facilities there. At Butyrka, his health went into a terrible downward spiral. He was in constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain, and they refused him any medical attention. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. Every one of those requests was either ignored or denied in writing. On the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. They put him in an ambulance, sent him across town to a different prison. But when he arrived there, they didn't put him in the emergency room. They put him in an isolation cell, they chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the next day, and it was the most horrifying, shocking, traumatizing, heartbreaking news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because of me. He was killed because he was my lawyer. He was killed because he worked for me.
Now, it's clear that this is it's an emotional, a heartbreaking pivot moment for you personally, and also for your determination to achieve justice. How have you channeled that hurt, that anger, that huge emotional wall into something positive?
Well, I just, after I got the news, it took me a little while to process it all. But when I could think clearly, when the fog of heartbreak and hysteria had died down a little, and I could think clearly, I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to put aside everything else I was doing, and I was going to devote all of my time, all of my energy, and all of my resources going after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. When I started this campaign to get justice for Sergei, at first I tried to get justice inside of Russia, but it was impossible. They circled the wagons completely. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people most complicit. And it became obvious to me that there was no chance of justice inside of Russia. So then I said to myself, if there's no chance of justice inside of Russia, we need to find it outside of Russia. And that's where I came up with this idea. Anybody who's traveled the world knows that there's Russians everywhere spending their money. And what happens is that these people commit crimes in Russia, financial crimes, like the one that Sergei had discovered. And then they bring their money to the West and they buy villas and yachts and send their kids to private schools and their parents for the best medical attention. And we've seen them here, we've seen them in the United States and in Europe. And I came up with this idea, which is that we might not be able to prosecute them for torture and murder that they've committed in Russia. We can't prosecute them in the West for that because we don't have jurisdiction. But we can freeze their assets and we can ban their travel. And I took this idea of freezing assets and banning the travel, and I took this idea to 2 senators in Washington, a Democratic senator named Benjamin Cardin from Maryland and Republican Senator John McCain from Arizona. And when we put this up for vote, it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And the Magnitsky Act became a federal law on December 14, 2012. Since then, we went to Canada. They passed theirs in 2017, the UK in 2018, the EU in 2020, Australia in 2021. In between, we've had Norway, Iceland, Kosovo, Montenegro. In total now, there are 35 countries that have Magnitsky Acts. And it's the basis not just for punishing the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, but it's the basis for punishing the people who waged the war in Ukraine. There's now thousands of people on the sanctions list. And this was the template. We created the template, which is now used across the board. When the Magnitsky Act was passed in the United States, Putin went out of his mind. In immediate and direct retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He then started going after me. He issued 8 Interpol arrest warrants for me, extradition requests, death threats, kidnapping threats. They made movies about me. They've sued me. They've done everything possible to try to destroy me. This Magnitsky Act is something they truly, truly hate. It's just something really just the worst thing for them.
So you've really got under their skin. And I believe actually Putin at one point asked Trump to extradite you from the US, where you currently were at the time, in Aspen, I believe, to extradite you off back to Russia. And Trump even had the temerity to say, that's a great idea, let me have a think.
Horrible. I mean, I always knew that Putin hated me. And he was, and by the way, Putin never mentions the names of his enemies except for me.
Right.
It's like this weird mafia thing. You don't mention the name of your enemies. But I got so firmly lodged in his mind that he was talking about me publicly. And as you mentioned, at the summit with Trump in Helsinki in 2018, he openly, in a press conference, asked Trump to hand me over. And then Trump said, I think that's a great offer.
Well, now, this brings us up to date. One of the big questions that the West is grappling with at the moment is the question of what to do with the sanctioned money. A lot of Russian assets are now held. I believe you mentioned earlier $300 billion are currently being held by Western banks and institutions of Russian state assets in some form. The big question, of course, is can this money from a corrupt regime be repurposed into something more useful? And one of the avenues is potentially to release that money to help Ukraine in its war against this brutal, this oppressive invasion which has taken place. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, so when the war started, I consider that what happened to me and what happened to Sergei Magnitsky and his family, that we were kind of the canary in the coal mine. We saw the murderous nature of the Putin regime. We saw the criminal nature of the Putin regime. We saw the lies, the prevarication, the misinformation. We saw it all. And I tried to tell everybody that this is an evil regime. This is a dictatorship that's going to do terrible things. We should contain them. We should disengage. And nobody listened. And then all of a sudden, on February 2022, Putin invaded Ukraine. And whatever happened to us has now been magnified and multiplied in the most horrific ways. And when I saw that invasion happening, it broke my heart because I could just, it broke everybody's heart, but it broke mine in particular. And like everybody else, I said, what can I do, to help the Ukrainians, the victims of this war of aggression? And, some people were, loading up gauze and ambulances. Some people were sourcing, drones. Some people were doing all sorts of different things to try to help the Ukrainians, bringing in refugees into their house. Well, the one thing that I could do that I'm uniquely qualified to do is I've spent the last 15 years running around the world, meeting with members of parliament, meetings with government officials to freeze assets. We've just frozen 300 billion of these assets after the war started. It seems to me that my skills could be very aptly applied to confiscating those assets and giving them to the Ukrainians. And so I started this campaign 2 years ago to confiscate the frozen Russian central bank reserves. And at first I encountered a total stone wall. The people, the government officials and parliamentarians said, no, we can't do this. And the assumption on their side was the war was going to end very quickly, and then the money could be used as some kind of bargaining chip in a ceasefire. But I know Putin, and this war is not ending anytime soon. Putin is in it right up to his eyeballs. He has absolutely no capacity to back down. If he did back down, he would lose power, go to jail, and die. He's in this thing for the long run. The war has been going on now, and the money is sitting there. And we're now in this terrible situation where the money that the West is providing for Ukraine is starting to deplete. The Congress almost didn't approve a $61 billion military aid package. The European Union almost didn't approve a 50 billion euro aid package because of different people arguing against it. And so the longer this war has gone on, the more damage it's been has been inflicted on Ukraine, somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion of damage. And we're sitting on $300 billion of central bank reserves of Russia. And so it's obvious now, not just to me, but to a lot of other people, that this money needs to be confiscated. The original idea was to confiscate it ultimately at some point for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And I'm saying that we're not going to be able to rebuild Ukraine if Russia succeeds. We need to use it for defense of Ukraine. I'm happy to say that the United States, a few weeks ago, passed something called the Repo Act. At the same day as the United States approved the $61 billion military aid package, they approved the Repo Act. The Repo Act says that any of the central bank reserves held in the United States could be confiscated and sent to Ukraine. That's a great and important move. Unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't have a lot of Russian assets. Russia knew that the U.S. would be the most robust in reacting to their war, and so they moved almost all the money out. I think there's only like $5 billion left. But still, it's extremely significant and symbolic. I know that the UK is also supporting the idea. The UK has got about $25 billion. But unfortunately, the lion's share of the money sits in the EU. It's $220 billion sits at Euroclear in Belgium. And the EU, in order to make any decision, they need total consensus. They need unanimity of all 27 member states. And there's a few pro-Putin member states, like Hungary, in this mix. And so they're all dancing around the head of a needle, negotiating with themselves. They've come to the decision just a few days ago that it would be okay to confiscate the interest on the money, just not the money. That's a few $1 billion. That's helpful, but it's not $220 billion. Now, people ask me what I think is going to happen, and I predict that as the war continues to carry on, as we dig deeper into our pockets, the economic and financial realities will set in, and the Europeans will confiscate that money.
Right. So you think there will be some movement. And, of course, the political context is going to shape that discussion as well as the war in Ukraine drags on into what is now its third year. I presume that you also encounter other objections. We've certainly seen the type of arguments, if you like, against that, questions about the legality, the legal frameworks under which this can be done. If we do it with the Russians, is there a precedent being set which is unhelpful for perhaps other funds that are in some way confiscated? And even that it may be detrimental or upset the whole global financial system. What's the arguments that you can deploy against some of these more publicly aired objections?
Well, on the legality side, the naysayers say, well, the Russian money is protected by sovereign immunity, in the same way as an embassy. Russian embassy is the property, the sovereign property of the Russian state. If you go into an embassy, you're in Russian territory. You're not in British territory here in London.
Right. So they're treating financial assets in the same way as physical assets.
And in theory, that's correct. It is sovereign property and it is protected by sovereign immunity. But that's not the end of the story. So Russia is also has to abide by international law. You're not allowed to invade neighboring countries, cause hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion of damages, and not pay those damages. That's called the law on countermeasures. And there's, every day, all day long, there are conflicts of law in the world. And in this particular case, I believe that the law on countermeasures should trump the law on sovereign immunity.
Right.
And to the extent that it doesn't, you can legislate. So that's what lawmaking is all about. That's what parliaments do. And so if there's a conflict of law and you need to define how that conflict gets resolved, you should legislate.
And you think this legislation needs to happen within the EU specifically?
Well, it happened in the United States. The Repo Act was a piece of legislation that specifically ironed out any potential conflict.
And there's no reason why the EU couldn't follow suit?
The EU could absolutely do it if they wanted to.
Okay, clear, very clear. What about precedent?
Well, there is precedent for doing this. After the Iraq invaded Kuwait, that was considered to be a terrible thing to do, and we confiscated Iraqi central bank reserves.
Right.
Same thing happened after the Second World War. We confiscated German property. Now, the only difference between this and that is that the confiscation took place after the war was over. What we're talking about is doing the confiscation while the war is still taking place. And that's the only difference. But there's absolute legal precedent for doing it.
Right. And the final argument, which is that there'll be some upset to the global financial system, that the volumes of money at stake here are so big that it'll send ripples that are going to be destabilizing. Is that?
Well, it's possibly true. Let's say that Britain did this by themselves, and no other country did this. Then people could say, "Well, I'm not sure I want to buy any UK assets because something might happen." But we're not talking about Britain doing this by themselves. We're talking about the U.S., Britain, EU, Canada, Japan, Switzerland, Australia, all doing it together. And if we all do it together, where will the Saudi princes and the Chinese central bank keep their money? They're not. The reason why they call these things reserve currencies is because they're liquid currencies. Right. You can't keep your money in Iranian rials or Argentine pesos.
So concerted action is the key, and that demands an excellent amount of diplomacy. And you are the human rights diplomat par excellence. What chance do you think we've got of this happening?
I think it's almost certain to happen. And the reason is because at the end of the day, it's just who should pay for this? Should the tax? So whose money is more precious, the taxpayers' money or Putin's money? It's just politically unfeasible to continue digging into our own pocket without digging into Putin's pocket first. It's just a political reality. And we've seen this before. Everyone argued, oh, should we or should we not send tanks? And then we sent tanks. And should we or should we not send long-range missiles? We sent long-range missiles. What about F-16s? We sent F-16s. It's the same type of argument. There's all these naysayers. We've never done this before. What about this? What about that? And in the end, the political and the reality on the ground will make this thing happen.
Well, we can all hope that this is indeed what's going to happen. Before I let you go, Bill, I know that there are others who are also being brutalized by this regime, and you have a particular interest in a number of them. Can you just tell us what you're working on now?
Well, one of my most important projects, is getting a man named Vladimir Kara-Murza out of Russian prison. When I traveled the world to pass...
Just explain. So he is a very important opposition leader in Russia.
So Vladimir Kara-Murza he's about 15 years younger than me. He was a former journalist who became a member of the Russian opposition. He was educated in Britain. He actually has a British passport. He went to Cambridge. He went to high school in Harrow. We traveled the world together working on the Magnitsky Act. He testified in front of various parliaments on behalf of the Russian people, telling them that the Magnitsky Act was an important way to counter Putin. The Putin regime was so angry with him for doing that they tried to kill him with poison in 2015 and 2017, nearly died in both cases. He was in a coma, multiple organ failure, but he survived. And then after the war started, he went back to Russia to protest the war. And he was swiftly arrested after going on to CNN, calling Putin a war criminal and a murderer. And he received the single longest sentence of any political prisoner in Russia, 25 years. They then sent him to Siberia. He's now sitting in a prison in Omsk, Siberia, and they've stuck him in solitary confinement. He's in a cell 23 hours a day. He's suffering terribly from the after effects of the poison. He probably will die in custody if we don't get him out. And so I have spent the last 2 years since he's been arrested trying to find a way, first of all, to elevate his profile so that the Western politicians understand how important he is. And then once that's been done, and it has been done, he's now well recognized he was the second most important political prisoner in Russia after Alexei Navalny. Now that Alexei Navalny has been killed, he's the first most important political prisoner, also at risk of dying. And we're now trying very, very hard to figure out how to get him out. And that probably involves some type of prisoner swap, which is why I'm talking to all the governments around the world to find a Russian prisoner to swap him out with.
Right. Well, look, first of all, thank you so much for taking us through what is an inspirational and extraordinary story. We wish you absolutely the best and success in both continuing your extraordinary campaign with the Magnitsky Act, but also in holding this regime to account for all its brutality in every sphere and for the release of Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you very much, Bill Browder, for being with us.
Thank you.